In 1991, there was a movie made that a lot of people haven't heard about, but those who know me have heard me talk constantly about this movie. And in fact, when I mention it, I think a few are going to roll their eyes, because I always talk about this movie called Grand Canyon. I know some people have watched it because I've recommended it before. And I can't tell you quite why this movie, again, it was fairly popular at the time, but I can't really tell you why, other than I have thought it was one of the most insightful comments about modern life. And the premise of the story, it's set in Los Angeles, and it's a variety of people, some connected, some not, who come from a variety of backgrounds, and it's their struggle to understand their lives and the meaning of their lives and the mistakes they make in the modern world, amidst the modern realities, the urban realities of Los Angeles and the world in which we live. You know, things, trying to figure out who they are in the midst of racism and inequality and violence and gun violence and various challenges that we try to come to grips with in the world we live today. And it does it rather beautifully. And the story opens with a man named Mac, who is driving home from a Los Angeles Lakers basketball game, and his car kind of breaks down in a rough neighborhood. And he calls for a tow truck, but as he's waiting for the tow truck, he's approached by a gang of young men who begin intimidating him and begin to frighten him. And it's kind of a frightening moment until Simon, the tow truck driver, an African-American tow truck driver, appears and rescues Mac. And that movie starts with this development, this beginning. Mac feels eternally grateful and begins this relationship with Simon. Two people, one an upper middle class white man connecting to a blue collar black man, and about the relationship they develop and their conversations and the intersections they have. But one of my favorite lines, and I'm actually going to quote this rather extensively because it's this conversation they're having about their lives, that Simon shares an insight he has. And he asks Mac, he says, "Have you ever been to the Grand Canyon? It's pretty, but that's not the thing of it. You can sit on the edge of that big old thing, and those rocks, the cliffs, the rocks are so old. It took so long for that thing to get like that. And it ain't done either. It happens right there while you're watching it. It's happening right now as we are sitting here in this ugly town. When you sit on the edge of that thing, you realize what a joke we people really are. What big heads we have thinking that what we do is going to matter all that much. Thinking that our time here means diddly to those rocks. Just a split second we have been here. The whole lot of us. That's a piece of time so small to even get a name. Those rocks are laughing at me right now. Me and my worries. Yeah, it's real humorous, the Grand Canyon. It's laughing at me right now. And you know what it felt like? I felt like a gnat that lands on the butt of a cow, chewing cud on the side of the road that you drive by doing 70 miles per hour. The truth is, I find that statement, that recollection of his experience of the Grand Canyon, I find that both comforting, but to be honest, also unsettling. And I've been to the Grand Canyon, and I, to be honest, can relate even as a young man when I went to the Grand Canyon, I could relate to that experience of the awesomeness, the vastness. Who here has been to the Grand Canyon? That powerful experience of experiencing something so old and ancient and something that has taken thousands and thousands of years to be formed. And to stand there and you do feel kind of small. And yet, you feel connected to the cosmos somehow. I think the truth is, if you listen to the Grand Canyon, you might be able to hear the voice of God. Now, most of us are familiar with the book of Job. It's a story written thousands and thousands of years ago. A story which was trying to come to grips with this human experience, this human reality of suffering. We modern, postmodern folks aren't the only ones who've wrestled with existential reality and the sense of how do we make sense of suffering. It's as old as the human experience. Thousands and thousands of years ago, someone wrote this story to try to come to terms with how do we explain human suffering. How do we come to terms with this? And it's a story trying to wrestle with that question, with what's going on when we experience such suffering, which every human being does. And if you remember, the story begins, there's kind of this debate going on in heaven between the angels. And one who's called the accuser tells God, well, the only reason that man Job down there is faithful to you is because he's blessed. He's got all the money and a great family and all kinds of things. And if you take away all those good things, then he won't be faithful to you. And so the story begins with a bet. If we take that away, will Job be faithful to God? And it's kind of an odd beginning to the story. In many ways, like many stories, it doesn't make full sense, but it does capture the sense of the arbitrariness of life, right? Up one day, down the other. And so as the story unfolds, everything is stripped away from Job. Everything, his health, his family, all his wealth, he is left suffering. Sores covering his body. And in the midst of that suffering, he's also suffering emotionally and spiritually, trying to understand why this has happened to him. Because the truth be told, to be human, we need to understand, right? We need to comprehend why this is happening. And so he has three friends who come to him who are trying to comfort him. But instead, they kind of try to convey to him, each in their own way, they try to say, well, this is happening to you, and the reason this is happening is you've done something wrong, right? You weren't faithful. That's why God's punishing you. You've done something wrong. And Job won't have any of it. He says, no, I've been righteous, I've been faithful, I've done nothing wrong, and Job is right. He's done nothing wrong. He refuses to accept the advice of his friends. Just accept you've done something wrong, and this will all make sense. Because we are struggle as human beings to make sense of bad things happening to good people and of the suffering we experience. It has to make moral sense to us. And the truth is, we might be critical of Job's friends who are trying to help Job understand. Maybe it'll help him through his suffering. But we do that all the time in many ways. There's a quote, I know y'all have heard this from me over and over again as well, by Rabbi Harold Kushner, who wrote a book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. It's a quote that I think we should remind ourselves over and over again. That quote is, "We would rather feel guilty than powerless." We would rather feel that we could have done something to prevent a bad thing happening. We'd rather feel like we had done somebody wrong or we had done God wrong. We'd rather feel that than really actually believe that things happen, that we're powerless before it. We're just like Job's friends. We want it to make sense, and so we struggle, and rightfully so, when we experience suffering in the world, both in other people and in ourselves. But Job won't have any of it. It's interesting, at the beginning of this, he says, "I've become a laughingstock to my friends, and though I called on God and God answered, a mere laughingstock, though I'm righteous and blameless." And it's interesting, those who are at ease have contempt for misfortune as the fate of those whose feet are slipping. How true is it? This is written thousands of years ago. How true is it that those who are in good fortune look down upon those who have misfortune as if it's their fault? They're poor. It must be some bad choices they made. They're sick. They must not have watched their weight. We'd rather feel guilty than powerless. And then the next verse. "The tents of marauders are undisturbed, and those who provoke God are secure, those God has in his hand." What's interesting about this line is essentially Job observes there are unrighteous people that have good things happen to them. It doesn't make sense. There are the marauders in the world who really should be punished, people doing things that are cruel and mean-spirited, and those, they should be suffering. But the world isn't made that way. And it's not right. And Job wrestles with that reality, which is our reality. He faces it head on. And we would like to think Job answers the question, why bad things happen to good people? But the book of Job doesn't give that answer. It doesn't give you a theological reason why people suffer. It doesn't give you an answer that says this is why this happens, because people act this way and people act that way. We'd like to think we have all the power in the world to prevent horrible things from happening. But it kind of gives us a hint of the first step, maybe of the beginning of wisdom. And it's an interesting hint. He says, "But ask the animals, and they will teach you, or the birds in the sky, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish in the sea inform you. Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In God's hand is the life of every creature and the breath of humankind." So Job's words says the beginning of being able to wrestle and come to terms with this question of human suffering, his own question, which never gets answered. The first step is to listen. To listen to creation around us. The first step is to contemplate the Grand Canyon, the trees, the earth, to see the vastness of creation and the cosmos. And then, if we listen, we might gain a deeper sense of meaning in the midst of it all. So there's this professor. His name's Brian Swim. And he actually teaches, and I love the name of this, evolutionary cosmology. Pretty cool. Huh? Evolutionary cosmology. And he wrote a great little book years ago called The Universe is a Green Dragon. And in this book, he argues that human beings are that aspect of creation, that aspect of the evolution of the universe. Human beings are that part of the universe that can be aware of the universe. That our purpose is to celebrate the universe, to reflect on it. The line he has in there, it is out of the dynamic of cosmic celebration that we were created in the first place. What is the human? The human is a space, an opening where the universe celebrates its existence. We are that part of the universe that listens to it. Whether you're a scientist studying molecules or a poet reflecting on the nature of the world around us, or whether you're a theologian wrestling with the meaning of it all. It first of all begins with silence and listening to creation around us. Now, the past few weeks, we've wrestled with the reality of nature and climate change and the environment, and I have shared how the struggle we have sometimes to find good news in the midst of, if you want to talk about suffering, not only human suffering, but the world itself, creation itself, is going through suffering. And we wonder what we can do. And a number of activists and scientists, one of the things they say that needs to happen, and I referred to this the first Sunday in which we wrestled with this question, one of the things that needs to happen beyond our personal choices, our decisions to be good environmentalists, to recycle, to take reusable bags, to go to the grocery store, those are good things. And even more than advocating for changes in our society and how we consume things, those things are important. They're big, they're challenging, seemingly almost impossible at times to think that we could come to terms with that. But what scientists and environmentalists and theologians say needs to happen most of all is a revolution of our hearts. A spiritual revolution in which we look at the world not as something we consume, but something we listen to. Meister Eckhart, who was a mystic in the 13th and 14th century, he describes this sense of contemplation of the world around us, of creation, and how we need that change in our hearts in order to really fully realize who God is calling us to be. It's the beginning of our answer to the question of human suffering and the suffering of the world, is to listen and contemplate creation around us. He had this great poem. He says, "Apprehend God in all things, for God is in all things. Every single creature is full of God, and is a book about God. Every creature is a word of God. And if I spend enough time with the tiniest creature, even a caterpillar, I would never have to prepare a sermon so full of God is every creature. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.